A very warm welcome. I'm Stefan, Götz Leadership Company in Germany, and I truly welcome a lady full of wisdom and leadership competency and knowledge, a thought leader, a CEO and co-founder of Möbius Executive Leadership, ever since 2005, I believe.
That's right.
So thank you for joining this podcast. The episode is about how can we turn uncertainty into opportunity? And it feels like nobody can make sense of what's happening now with the geopolitics, with the markets going crazy. So, Amy, how can you make sense of that situation? And how can we maybe help shifting perspective to help leaders grow and lead their companies forward?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Stefan, and for framing such a giant question and such an urgent question for our conversation. Maybe I'll just throw out a few threads of how I'm reflecting on the zeitgeist of this time and the extraordinary shifts that we're seeing on a daily basis in the news, and therefore what I think of as the leadership mandate of this moment. So for sure, we are in a time where a lot of unpredictable, seemingly random, but interrelated shifts are happening geopolitically, economically, relationally, culturally. And so one of the jobs I think of a leader is to be able to sense make for people and to give people an orientation in a time that feels very chaotic and chaotic. In a sense, leaders who can help make narrative meaning and guide people to what's most important, what to focus on in a time of incredible information saturation, give people a sense of groundedness and centeredness. But that sense making has to come from the ability to posit and explore multiple interpretations of the same situation, because the picture has gotten too complex for what my friend Jennifer Garvey Berger might call simple stories. We
Mhm.
can't live in a narrow narrative anymore where one side is right and the other side is wrong, and the answers are sort of obvious based on expertise and experience. We're in a world that's extremely emergent in very high flux. And so the meaning that has to be made is more of an adaptive meaning making. And in adaptive leadership, my friend Xander Grashaw talks about the importance of a leader being able to engage multiple interpretations before they move into problem solving or action.
Absolutely, fully agree, and I like the idea of staying in that realm of multiple interpretations. And my question is like, how can I, as a leader, come to that place, stay grounded in holding that tension that there's not one solution forward and we fix it, but it sounds like it's a creativity space.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It is a creativity space, and the competencies are quite different than what most leaders have matured over the last 2 decades. So, very senior leaders were brought up in a developmental mode of learning how to create followers, learning how to be very declarative and definitive, learning how to say, point a strategy on the horizon and drive collective action. Um, this is a time of collective intelligence before collective action, which is to say, there's a stage of leader as facilitator, or my friend Nicholas Johnny likes to call it leader as healer, where your real task is to, exactly as you said, is to widen your cup, to host multiple voices, to be more curious than certain, to be willing to be open to persuasion, and to have the change agility, the cognitive agility to iterate and change your mind. And that actually the ability to dance with life, with new information, with new trends, with new events, and to respond in real time in creative ways, in generative ways, that's going to be the art of the deal now.
Now, Now, if I was like one of these leaders now, being brought up or were brought up in that kind of framework,
Yes.
by what we just shared, I would be freaking out because I don't get this. I get this clarity and the sense making and then fixing it. So, I mean, what kind of capacity is the first door opener for me to engage with such a situation? What would you see as the capacity necessary?
It's a beautiful question. I would say I see two different responses from the leaders that come into my programs. One are the people who are appropriately freaking out because they understand they need to change their operating system, and
Mhm.
they come in with a kind of willingness and humility to be guided to the new. And I'll say something about what I think that looks like in a moment. And the other are those that who in their fear are doubling down on the existing strategy and hoping the change will not last very long. And I think
Yeah,
of
good
that.
idea.
I think there's a corollary to, alcoholics have to hit a certain bottom before they ask for help. I think it's going to be the same for those leaders. Uh, but in any event, your question is a beautiful one. What's the first step? I think the first step is understanding that you're scared and that you don't know, and being willing to be guided. And then what's the guidance? The first part of the guidance is to move the locus of attention, which has historically been on external events, external trends, and external opportunities, to move that gaze internal. Because there's real inner development, what's now called vertical development work that's required to run an organization or run a country or run a movement in this time. And that inner work is maturing soul qualities that are necessary in a time of chaos, that are much less necessary in simpler times, if there were even ever simpler times. So, what do I mean by soul maturity? I mean qualities, for example, of intellectual humility. I mean qualities of deep emotional intelligence, like I understand what I'm feeling. I know how to host and hold my own inner emotions, and I know how to receive and empathize with and be alert to what might be going on in your emotional landscape. Why does that matter? It matters because when people are in a higher state of fear, they cling to the old as a place of safety and security and certainty, and they're less willing to experiment and less able to adapt. So the ceiling on an organization's rate of change, or the amount of disequilibrium that that system or team can tolerate, is their ability to metabolize and host and integrate fear. So I don't think we can disaggregate anymore the inner competencies of
Yeah,
emotional self-management from the outer competencies of leading in change.
absolutely, I agree. I see it every day in my conversations I have with C-levels. They say, if you close down the micro, I would tell you that I don't have a clue about our direction. Actually, they wouldn't use the word scared or fear, but they say always respect. But anyhow, the respect is kind of, I could fail.
Yeah.
I could not maybe deliver. Now, how could we help? I mean, let's be honest, a big part of the leadership is whole by man, right? And it's an issue on its own that we could have. But is there any reference known to these male leaders that we could help them thrive on? So it's not like, most cases, if we ask leaders about fear, they would say, nah, nah, I'm not scared about anything. So what is a reference they know? What is an opening? What is helping them to say, okay, maybe I don't know the way forward to look inside, but somehow I know it's gonna be inspiring, it's gonna be opening. So what is something
Mm.
that would help them, broaden, open, engaging, receiving?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many strands in what you just said, Stefan. I'll just pick up on a few of them. One, the amount of hero leadership we've asked of senior leaders to be the sort of galvanizing champion who knows the way, knows the answer, and puts a tremendous pressure on people, and creates the fear of failure that you're alluding to. So I think the first shift is a collective shift where we have to stop seeing the leader as the hero guide. And we also have to befriend failure. My wonderful friend Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School wrote a book in the last year called The Right Kind of Failure, which I think is critical.
The right kind of failure. Interesting.
It's a critical contribution to this moment because when you're in a constant reinvention, there's no way to get it right all the time. And that pressure that success looks like not failing has to be removed from the picture. We have to know that failure is a sign of innovation. Failure means you're taking risks and you're learning. And that's failure that's driven by a willingness to move in disruptive ways and learn. It's not failure that's driven by lack of effort, lack of engagement, malfeasance. So what she means by the right kind of failure isn't people underperforming. It's high performers being given permission to go to the edge of the known, and befriend the mystery and learn on behalf of the entire system. And so the first thing I think we have to help leaders to do is to destigmatize failure. The second thing is to help them understand and get sensitized to when they are afraid and when others are afraid, because so much of daily business is being conducted in a state of high reactivity, and that will lead to unnecessary failure. And that will also inhibit appropriate risk taking, which means organizations become less and less developmentally oriented. They're not learning. They're not living human systems that are co-creating the future. So one of the doorways that we use to help leaders start to track a sort of low-grade fear is to share very basic neuroscience. So have you noticed a moment in the business where you had a strong reaction? And at the moment when you were upset, not when you caught your breath an hour later, but at the peak moment of your reactivity, how did you behave and how did you feel? They very rarely will name fear as the driving emotion. You're correct. They'll say, I was upset, I was surprised, I was anxious, I was disappointed, I was betrayed, I was frustrated. But how did you behave? And when you classify the behaviors, they're almost always a very truncated repertoire of moves based on early survival strategies, fight, flight, freeze. And those behaviors are a signal or a hallmark that the system is in threat. The system experiences the context as unsafe. And so it shuts down creative, fluid problem solving and starts to rely on a preset repertoire of reactive habits. And when people, especially senior teams, start to understand that they're spending a great deal of time communicating to one another from a state of low grade or high grade reactivity, they get the skill to intervene on their own process. It's as if they start to learn how to manage the emotional stress and strain they're under with real intelligence and with real awareness. And once a team has that in place, they can handle a lot more uncertainty and a lot more infringement or impingement of new information without getting derailed and de-skilled. The third thing you pointed to, and this is the last thing I'll say, is how can we get people ignited about the future? And I think part of the answer there is really creating more time inside organizational life for reflection and creativity. People do not spend a lot of time in artistry, in nature, in dreaming, in ideating, in lighthearted play about what the future could be. And the absence of joy in daily organizational life, the mundanity, the drive, the constant execution focus, I think strips us of what would otherwise be our innate capacity to make the future very different than the current moment. It would give us imagination. It would give us intuition. It would give us the joy of collaborative, invention. And I think leaders of the future are going to have to be those that create rituals and practices for co-creativity?
I can see the picture being painted. That is a picture I'm very thrilled about. I'm inspired about, and as you said, it needs to take space and time and rituals to design it, to open it. And I guess the opening gate is you're opening to something unknown. So could we find any reference to that? It's not the unknown, but it's a deeper knowing. It's a more profound knowing. It's something that I don't have to do it all the time. So if my team doesn't do it, I have to take on the burden and do more. But how can we invite people to that deeper knowing, to that profound knowing? Because, when you promised a certain profit by the quarter and you have, or cost of whatever, and you have an Excel sheet and a controller, giving you the information every week, there must be an opening that is enticing. So where is that opening where you are willing to start say, okay, maybe I don't have any idea about this way forward. My pressure is immense, but it's so enticing that, continuing the path we continue, it will not be better. There must be another way. So where is that opening that's so enticing?
I mean, I think what you're pointing to in a way is the gift of this moment, that it's so obvious to people that the way we've been doing business will not work going forward, that there starts to be, I think, a willingness to explore other ways of tapping into different facets of our innate intelligence. My sister has a beautiful model. My sister, Erica Ariel Fox, wrote a book called Winning from Within, in which she describes 4 central transformational capabilities or archetypes, using a sort of Jungian metaphors of symbols. And you could well argue that modern business has drawn almost exclusively on 2 out of the 4 archetypes, and that it's the absence of the full range of intelligences and tapping into, for example, the 4 quadrants of our brain and not just 2, that are leaving us less well equipped than we could be, to your point. It's not that we have to go purchase or secure other intelligences. We have to unlock or activate our full range of existing intelligence. That's a very different task. So she talks about the dreamer, which is the part of you that has vision and imagination and artistry and intuition and can see a future that is not here yet. She talks about the lover, which is the part of you that holds your own deep emotions and builds trust and creates belonging inside teams and inclusion and psychological safety necessary for adaptation. And I think that the dormancy of the dreamer lover competencies or capabilities, one could argue, are the missing potion for the future. The other 2, just to round out the model for the listeners, is the warrior, which is about speaking hard truths and taking action and results orientation. And the 4th is about the thinker, which in complexity is being able to differentiate the signal from the noise, and to, in a complex picture, notice what's happening at the margins of the system that are early warning signals or early opportunities that you need to pay panoramic attention to. So all 4 of these archetypes are hardwired into us. It's not that you're either a dreamer or a lover. It's not a typology. It's a roadmap of what it means to really have self-awareness and choice, so that moment by moment you're drawing on these archetypes based on what's optimized in the context and not defaulting to the comfort zone and habit that you have grown up and refined over time. So one part of the answer, or one part of the invitation, Stefan, I think, is to become more multidimensional as a leader, and to wake up dormant facets of your repertoire. I think a second thing is to recognize what's implicit in what you said, which is one can access intelligence beyond the cognitive mind, and that there are long perennial practices, meditative practices, somatic practices, wilderness practices, artistic, creative practices that enable us to tap into what David Bohm called the implicate order, or what in mystical terms one might call non-direct, intelligence. And we all have access to that portal of possibility, but it means pulling out of day-to-day grind and making time for and prioritizing that quietude or that solitude or that receptive function, which is more of a feminine principle, to your earlier point. And I think the most beautiful organizational description of this comes from my friend Otto Scharmer, who in his Theory U really talks about what it means to leave the known world and spend some time in the liminality of listening deeply to life, to silence, to each other. And in that sort of field of receptivity and attunement, fresh possibilities start to emerge that are impossible to conceive or see from the day-to-day mind. That's also what Joseph Campbell meant when he suggested we go on a hero's journey and respond to the call to adventure. It's to leave the known world and enter the mystery. Some of these sound very spiritual, but in some sense, I believe organizations are going to have to tap into their own soulfulness in order to meet the future.
I deeply resonate with the archetypes that you mentioned and the lover and the dreamer. And I do know that you have another podcast coming up with Leading with the Heart. So I would like to open up that space a little more. For many executives I talk to, is like when I talk to, there's more than these 10% of your consciousness. You can see it in their face. What do you mean? Yeah, there's 90% more to tap into. So the 90% is certainly our big heart. And interestingly enough, many leaders I talk to, I realize they have a big heart.
They do.
Big heart. And maybe it's a fence around it, but it's not that they don't have it. It's just an exploration of how much more intelligence, capacity, connecting, how can we describe best this phenomenal capacity to our audience? Say, listen, wow, when you ask men about feelings, they say, yeah, I'm hungry or thirsty. But no, there's everything already here. It's just a matter of exploration. So how could we describe that huge capacity that can handle all what we said before?
Yes. Beautiful, beautiful question. Let me say a little bit about organizational psychology and then answer your question about the giant heart. Most organizational cultures are built on an industrial psychological model in which the workforce is thought of in largely technical terms, or at best, sort of as knowledge workers. And we created organizational cultures that devalued the body. They asked people to work past natural limits and natural rhythms of what a body can sustain. They devalued relationship and interdependence and put a very high premium on individual success and ambition and what is called resilience, which basically means not having relational needs. And they completely excluded the notion of spirit. So when you're being asked to show up and simply contribute your mental activity, you have to be proactively numbing your emotions, because otherwise they walk in the door with you. They're hardwired into our experience of daily life. So one of the things I ask leaders to do in my programs is to make a rigorous and brutal inventory of all the small and large ways that they're numbing themselves in order to not feel themselves all day long. And you get an extraordinary list of daily and weekly behaviors that run from what seem like benign activities like reading the news or overcommitting or exhausting oneself or isolating to things that are much more overtly problematic like addictions. And when you ask them, what's the cost of that numbing? Why would we talk about that in a leadership program? People very immediately understand. They're hacking off their felt experience, their passion, their love, their intimacy, and they're walking much too alone in their role as leaders. And when you let the poignancy of that loneliness just sit in, as a felt sense in the room, everybody hungers for something else. You don't have to teach people to care. You don't have to teach people to want to tend to one another, to want to experience themselves as generously interwoven in a community. That's human nature. You just have to highlight the cost of the current contract. And then people's immediate impulse is towards relatedness, is towards community, is towards entwining. I then do a next exercise, which I think is really important because we have been taught to not need each other and to rely on ourselves to a disproportionate and unnatural degree. We also don't have a natural relational vocabulary. When I ask even very senior leaders, very successful people, how could somebody support you emotionally? Universally, groups can come up with two things. They could listen to me or they could hold me. Well, the truth is there are hundreds of ways somebody could emotionally support you. But if you don't have a vocabulary and you haven't built a kind of inner circle of intimacy, you neither know what to ask for or who to ask. So part of what I believe leaders need to do now in this time of great pressure and impossibility is to start to have a language of interdependence and community, or said a different way, to welcome the quality of love and caring in the workplace. It's not at all unusual, Stefan, that I'll take a group that's been working together for a decade or longer, and on the last day they'll say to me, I've worked next to so-and-so for a long time. I had no idea they had an autistic child, or I had no idea their parent had dementia, or I had no idea that they immigrated young and that they feel bullied every time I raise my voice in a team meeting. Like, we don't know one another's interiority. And in the absence of that information, we're acting in ways that are constantly re-triggering people's early childhood hurts and causing them to be knocked off balance. So this is not only about reintegrating kindness, or what you called the big heart in the world, but it's also about helping people to stay resourced and bring their best day in and day out in the workplace. And that to me is an obvious business imperative, particularly at a time which is under so much pressure.
Absolutely. Staying resourced, that's a very powerful picture to me. And it gives the idea there is resource, there's not a scarcity.
Yes.
And we need to create it, but you are the source, you are the resource. Now, I think we're getting closer to that idea that being centered, being grounded will help, opening all senses, all capacities of intellectuality that we have, not kind of pressing towards life, but letting life come, and you will have senses filter it and make sense of it. But it's not going to be maybe your sense of it, which feels good or bad, but it's more what I probably call more what is true. So what is your wisdom about this centeredness, about this groundedness, about exploring who am I, about this big resource? So not taking the idea I have to learn something and add on, but I don't believe you have to learn something except to know who you are. So what is your perspective around this notion of centeredness, groundedness?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say the part that I think is easy and the part that's deep. The part that's easy is making sure that you're in what my friend Tony Schwartz calls a shape of a corporate athlete. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Most leaders are absolutely exhausted. Their mental health is very compromised. They're intellectually oversaturated and they're lonely. So that's not a sustainable roadmap for success. There has to be a turning inwards to take care of your body, to create love and connection around you for emotional support, to take time for reflection and metabolizing of life experience. So there's just a simple way of thinking about what kind of shape am I in? Am I future ready, or am I really in a state of subtle collapse that I'm trying to push through? Right? That's the easy answer. The deeper answer, I think, is that we have generation on generation of untreated trauma in the cultural fabric of the world and therefore of every organization. And when leaders take the time and commit to doing a deeper healing journey for themselves, for their families, for their ancestors, for their collectives, there's a kind of freeing up of real estate. It's like you get back an enormous amount of RAM in your operating system. That's white space that can be created by fresh potential, can be inhabited by new ideas, can be saturated by vitality and fresh capacity. So I myself believe that it is part of vertical development isn't just becoming emotionally fluent, but it's actually taking the time to do deeper restorative work that has the possibility of really integrating earlier life experience. One of the things we do as part of our leadership programs is a systematic inventory of the kind of adverse incidents people have experienced early in life, particularly those in the first 7 years of life that are so developmentally formative of people's beliefs and fears and interpretive systems. And fairly universally, people are either struggling with things that happened that they haven't processed, or absences of love and attunement and encouragement that should have happened for healthy self-esteem and healthy emotional resilience. And when you can stop and go back and tend to those hurts or those make up some of that attachment breach, the person is freed up at a level that is really catalytically different in terms of who they could be to lead themselves, to heal their families, and to drive excellence. So I don't think we can disconnect the inner journey of self-exploration and alchemy from the journey of outer potential and contribution. And I think organizations that are willing to support leaders to do that deeper self-reflective work, whether it's through coaching or leadership programs or retreats or some kind of a more psycho-spiritual path of development they would select, doesn't matter, same. But it does matter that you cultivate your inner life in that way.
Yeah, deeply resonate with your wisdom about this point, and I call it life is a mirror. So, most people say, okay, when my team doesn't perform or somebody underperforms, then the blaming game starts, and which is obvious when you don't deal with your own stuff, because is life is your mirror. It's actually creating a training ground. Training ground, not to see the underperformer to be blamed, but understanding that people will grow once they are seen. And when you still have judgment on whatever underperforming, lack of whatever, then you don't build the bridge to this, particular facet. So, as you talked about these childhood traumas that I fully agree, most people in the boardroom, when, sometimes they get the idea they're just kids at the age of 3 or 4 years old that are in the sandbox and playing with the shuffles and having had dealt with these experiences. What is your wisdom about that how could we call them? Under every problem we face, in my experience, the problem is not the problem.
Mhm.
Underneath, quite often, when we go into these experiences, we realize that underneath there is a certain gift to be given.
Mhm.
So if we don't see the problem as a problem, but a gateway to next level,
Mhm.
then it's about learning that there are gifts that I was given to be shared. Now, in my example about this underperforming person, not starting to blame it, but relate to it emotionally. And then it's like building the bridge of trust and of acceptance. And then asking the question, what do I need to give rather than take? What will help the team go forward? What's missing that I can give? So, what is your wisdom about this idea, turning I'm lacking of something rather than no, there's everything within, all the resources you said.
Yeah. Well, you're pointing to two beautiful ideas. I think the first notion is what you described as letting life teach you. So one of the things we're hoping to instill in leaders as a self-reflective practice is in a breakdown, whatever that breakdown might be, whether it's a breakdown in an initiative, in a project, in a relationship, to use every breakdown as an opportunity to point back inside and look and say, what's my part of this and what's mine to learn? And that practice of reading the book of life as a constant invitation to address what's unfinished, uncooked, and unconscious inside me means I'm constantly in a process of growing and maturing and expanding. And that's endlessly fascinating, endlessly rich, and has boundless potential for who I could become as a leader. So it's a very thrilling orientation. It's also more accurate. But the second thing you said, I think, is quite important and touching, which is if I stop looking through the lens of assessment and judgment at the people around me, trying to sort their strengths and their weaknesses, and instead I take a sort of psychologically informed lens, I would start to see that the things that look like executive derailers or dysfunctional behaviors are almost always early childhood survival strategies that were cultivated in a context in which that was the highest intelligence, that was the highest possibility for self-protection and to stay emotionally intact. But it's long past its sell-by date, meaning I'm using that behavior that I learned in childhood now, long after the threat is gone, and in an antiquated and unhelpful way. So then my orientation as a coach or a facilitator or a leader becomes, how can I help that person's lower the level of fear in their system so they're not defaulting to that survival strategy, and we free up their optionality for action and contribution to be in the present moment and not in the past. Part of the dilemma is we have historic trauma talking to historic trauma talking to historic trauma, and it's very hard to hear anybody. Um, and I do think that's usually what's happening not only in top teams, but as you said, in board conversations, all the more pressurized by the fact that people are being asked to create short-term value all the time, makes it very hard to see the far horizon. And it makes it more likely that people will short circuit into these defensive patterns. My friend Michelle Brody wrote a wonderful book called Own Your Armor, that is a resource for top teams to start looking at how their childhood defense behaviors show up in team dynamics and to free up the space to be more productive. And I think that investing in team coaching in that way is a tremendous thing. It's a very immediate intervention. It has immediate impact and benefit to any team I've ever worked with. Just to get a little bit more aware of one another's survival patterns and how to call each other out of them.
I want to spend the last couple of minutes
Mm.
to go a little bit deeper in the area that you investigate and explore more of the trauma-informed leadership.
Mm.
and find words and explanations and connections for us to understand the profound wisdom that is behind it and how much resources we can open up. So maybe you want to share a little bit about that wisdom.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Stefan. You know, I've had the privilege of being a leadership coach and consultant for almost 30 years. And when I started my practice, most of the emphasis in the domain of coaching was on behavioral change. And most of the interventions were at the level of cognitive awareness of behavioral choice A over behavioral choice B. And then there was a movement about 20 years ago to deepen the lens of looking to be starting to understand what were the mindsets or frames or paradigms or mental models that were shaping people's behavior. So we started going a little bit deeper. And then the lens got a bit deeper. What do we mean by mental model? We don't just mean ideas or paradigms or ways of intellectually understanding a context. We have to also be paying attention to the emotions and the fears and the relational needs and the unmet needs that are underneath the mental models that produce the behavior. So you can see there's like a growing awareness that what's shaping executive interaction is sourcing from something psychological, from something deeper than just cognition. And I think one of the contributions that Mobius has made to the field of organizational development, in large part due to my wonderful relationship with my teacher, Thomas Hubel, who's a world expert on trauma integration, both personal and family trauma, but also collective trauma, is to understand that the emotions that are at the deepest root of our behavior source themselves out of real trauma and hurt. What do I mean by trauma? I mean any experience that the psyche finds overwhelming. It's our protective response to a situation that we can't process in the moment of the experience. And there are many, many examples that people have lived. I'll just name some to make it vivid for people. I have a parent who has an alcohol problem. I have a home in which there's domestic violence. I get asked too early to go to boarding school before I really can care for myself. I get bullied on the playground. I have a disability. My family has a loss that creates so much grief that my parents don't have an ability to nurture me. I grow up in a context of war and violence, and I'm constantly seeing things that my mind can't metabolize as a child. I grow up in poverty and I feel a sense of existential insecurity. We're constantly moving and I don't have a sense of home or place. My parents go to another country and leave me for years at a time in order to build a better life for us. Many, 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 many examples. Those are big ones. There are also lots of little ones that happen in daily life. And because all of that is unprocessed, we build organizations that have trauma symptoms in their fabric. For example, a certain quality of numbness that we talked about earlier in this discussion, a certain quality of dissociation, a certain quality of minimalization. So there's a problem or there's an ethical breach and we all go into denial, or we all pretend it's not happening, or we talk about it on the water cooler, but we can't have the real conversation in the boardroom. All of those are signs of what you would, through a family therapy lens, call dysfunctional trauma symptoms. But it's equally true inside organizational life. So what it means to be a trauma-informed leader is two things. One, I understand the prevalence of trauma as a driving force in organizational dynamics. That's one. And two, I have a sensitivity to my own trauma responses so that I don't enact them, but I actually manage them in an effective way. I'm not contributing to the spiraling, escalating trauma symptoms around me. I'm bringing clear, fresh water to the conversation. And that's why I think the healing journey is such an important one for a transformational leader.
Bringing fresh water to the conversation. That's beautiful. And so simple as, most people, when we enter a meeting or a discussion, we're just jumping out an old meeting, not being there yet, being present, and bringing not fresh water but old water. And then we bring the super old water from our trauma. So
Yeah, the most beautiful description I know of this comes from another teacher of mine, Shai Tubali, who describes the heart chakra as having three layers. The first layer is the outermost layer that responds to the events of daily life. And that's okay. Most of us can host the outermost layer. But the dilemma of that is that the outermost layer reverberates on the middle layer, which is the historic, long held hurts and fears that get activated by current events and trigger us into being less skillful. But the good news is, to your point earlier about our natural resource, the innermost layer of the heart is untouched by that trauma and is a constant wellspring of possibility, of love, of open-heartedness, and of, fresh water. So we have to help people to tap into that.
yeah, very interesting about this idea and this concept about three layers. I haven't heard about these before, but it's so enticing to know that there is a very vulnerable yet enticing and energetic, pure resource that's available. And what I learned from you today is that if we can just make leaders understand the cost of going the old way,
Mm.
which brings them some awareness about what they are not just missing out, but what the cost will be about not being able to make sense of this ambiguity,
Mm.
but helping them to join with their biggest asset that's available to touch into that journey, the vertical journey, and be willing to be led by a group, by whoever, in a safe space of just discovery,
Yeah.
then the magic can happen. And the magic is not about fixing, the magic is about realizing there's a much deeper and broader knowing that brings wealth and understanding and commitment and connectedness to everyone. So everybody's going to feel safe and wants to explore the greater version of himself.
Mm. It's so utterly infectious and delicious to hear you get ignited with that, Stefan. And it's my experience that if a team will take a few days to go on that journey of discovery together, that magic is the inevitable outcome of that investment. And it looks a lot like people coming back into their heart, coming back into their life force, coming back into the threshold of their possibilities. It's a joyful journey, reliably so, and I think naturally, organically so.
Wonderful. Amy, I'm so thankful for a meaningful conversation.
As am I.
uh, that we could maybe open up a new space, a new realm that's so joyful and resourceful, and that we share our gifts out there for everybody to access it, and that we collectively step up to that who we really are. And I know you are at the forefront of leading that way. And hope next time we will meet in person
I'm looking
somewhere
very
on
much
this
forward.
planet.
I'm looking very much forward. And maybe I would just close by saying, Stefan, that I do believe our generation is being asked to take a pause, a collective pause right now, and seek wisdom and seek compassion and seek generosity in a fresh way, in a new way. And I hope that this conversation will have inspired people to take one step in that direction.
Thank you so much, Amy. So take care and hopefully see you sometime soon in person.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.